The neon lights of a rundown bar flickered weakly, casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked pavement of the near-empty parking lot. It was past 1 in the morning, and the only sounds cutting through the silence were the distant hum of passing 18-wheelers on the highway and the occasional metallic clang of a loose street sign swaying in the night breeze. The bar itself, a relic from a different era, sat hunched on the edge of a forgotten road, its weathered wooden sign barely holding together, the letters missing in places like a mouth with too many lost teeth. Inside, the air had been thick with the stench of whiskey, sweat, and tobacco, the dim lighting barely illuminating the weary faces of those who sat slumped over their drinks, veterans of their own personal wars. Men who had nothing left but their bar stools and the occasional grumbled conversation about better days that had long since abandoned them. For them, the bar was a sanctuary, a place where time stopped, where the world outside didn't exist until they staggered out into the cold night air, eyes squinting against the harsh reality waiting beyond the threshold. Monica Davis stepped out into that night, her boots crunching against the gravel as she adjusted the worn leather strap of her bag on her shoulder. The air carried the lingering scent of rain from earlier that evening, mingling with the faint aroma of gasoline and asphalt still warm from the day's heat. She wasn't the kind of woman to frequent places like this, but tonight had been an exception. A single drink, nothing more, a moment to sit in the quiet corner of a place where no one recognized her, where she didn't have to carry the weight of the cases she fought, the battles she waged against a system that saw men like Officer Travis Mitchell as protectors instead of predators. She had spent the last 2 weeks tearing apart yet another uniformed thug in court, exposing his lies, dismantling his fabricated reports, forcing his peers to squirm under cross-examination as they tried to cover for him. It was exhausting work, knowing that every victory was a drop in the ocean, that for every cop like him taken off the streets, another waited to take his place. But quitting was never an option, and neither was looking away. Her car was parked at the far end of the lot, a black sedan that blended into the shadows, unremarkable and practical. She reached into her pocket, fingers curling around the familiar weight of her keys, her thoughts still running through the details of tomorrow's deposition, the next fight waiting for her in the morning. It was only when she clicked the button to unlock the door that she felt it a presence, the unmistakable weight of being watched. She didn't tense, didn't turn abruptly. Instead, she let her gaze flicker to the side mirror, catching the faint glow of a cigarette ember in the darkness. Officer Travis Mitchell stood leaning against his squad car, the red and blue paint barely visible under the dim parking lot lights. He was watching her, his posture casual, but there was something in the way he stood, the way he slowly inhaled from his cigarette, exhaling the smoke through his nose like a predator assessing its prey. His uniform was slightly unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms thick with muscle and a tattoo peeking from beneath the fabric, something military-looking, though she doubted he had ever seen combat outside the streets he prowled with his badge and gun. His face was the kind that had once been handsome but had hardened with time, the edges sharpened by years of unchecked authority, of knowing that he could do whatever he wanted and never face the consequences. She knew his type. She had seen him before, not just in courtrooms but in the streets, in the reports stacked on her desk, in the bruises on the faces of the people who sat across from her, recounting stories that never changed. He was the kind of cop who didn't just enforce the law, he bent it, twisted it, made it into something that worked in his favor. He was the kind who saw fear as power, who enjoyed the way people tensed up when he walked into a room. And now he was looking at her like she was just another problem he was about to solve. Monica didn't react. She opened her car door, kept her movements slow, deliberate. "Late night," Mitchell said, his voice carrying easily across the empty lot, smooth but edged with something sharp, something coiled tight beneath the surface. She didn't answer, sliding into the driver's seat. "You in a hurry?" he asked, taking another slow drag from his cigarette. "Still," she said nothing. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "That's right. You don't talk to cops, do you?" He took a step forward, boots scuffing against the pavement, the sound deliberate. "I remember you." Monica's grip on her keys tightened. "You were the one who took down Officer Daniels last month," he continued, as if she needed the reminder. "Real shame. Good cop." She finally looked at him then, her eyes unreadable. If he was a good cop, he wouldn't have beaten a 16-year-old unconscious. Mitchell's smirk didn't waver, but she saw the slight twitch in his jaw, the way his fingers flexed briefly before relaxing again. "Guess that depends on who you ask." She turned back to her car, but before she could close the door, his hand shot out, gripping the frame, holding it open. "Hold on a second," he said, still smiling, but there was no warmth in it. Monica exhaled slowly, her patience wearing thin. "Am I being detained?" Mitchell chuckled, shaking his head. "You lawyers and your questions." His fingers tapped against the car's metal, slow, measured beats. "Relax. Just making conversation." She didn't move. His smile faded slightly. "That's right. You think you're smarter than everyone else, don't you?" Her voice was even when she replied. "Move your hand." Mitchell didn't move. Instead, he leaned in, his breath tinged with smoke and the sour remnants of whatever he had been drinking before he stepped outside. "You think you're untouchable," he murmured. Monica's patience snapped. "I think you're about to make the worst mistake of your life." He grabbed her wrist. The motion was automatic for him, a reflex, something he had done 100 times before to people who couldn't fight back. But this time, he had miscalculated. Monica moved fast, twisting her wrist against his grip, using his own strength against him. His hand slipped for a fraction of a second, and that was all she needed. She turned sharply, her free arm coming up in a practiced motion, slamming into his wrist, breaking his hold completely. Mitchell stumbled back, blinking in surprise. "Oh," he muttered, as if finally realizing she wasn't just another woman who would take it. Monica didn't move. She didn't need to. The challenge was clear in the space between them, a silent standoff, the tension thick enough to choke on. Mitchell's nostrils flared, his fingers curled into fists, and then a slow clap echoed from the bar's entrance. They both turned. A figure stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a cigarette dangling from his lips. His silhouette was unmistakable, the kind of presence that carried weight without effort, the kind of face that had been on screens for decades, burned into the consciousness of men like Mitchell. Clint Eastwood. He exhaled smoke, looking Mitchell up and down with something between amusement and disappointment. "That," Eastwood said, his voice calm, measured, and carrying the kind of authority that couldn't be bought, was a mistake. Mitchell's face darkened. "And Monica just smiled." Mitchell's nostrils flared as his pulse pounded in his ears. His fingers twitched, his body still tense from the unexpected counter by Monica. He wasn't used to being caught off guard, wasn't used to someone resisting, and certainly wasn't used to being humiliated in front of others. His grip on power was his lifeline, and right now it was slipping through his fingers. He felt the weight of Eastwood's stare, those cold, calculating eyes sizing him up like he was nothing more than an inconvenience. That should have been enough to make him stop, to make him rethink his actions. But the burning in his gut, the sheer rage of being challenged by a woman, no less, wouldn't let him back down. His entire body screamed at him to take back control, to make sure she never thought she could pull a stunt like that again. His pride wouldn't allow anything less. Monica remained still, poised like a viper ready to strike again if needed, but calm, unaffected by his seething anger. She had seen this kind of man before, knew his type, a man who had spent his whole life being feared, never questioned, never opposed. And now that someone had stood up to him, he didn't know how to react other than through blind aggression. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was reacting. That made him dangerous. But Monica had dealt with worse. She had walked into courtrooms where cops like him sat smugly at the defendant's table, knowing the system would protect them. She had torn apart their lies, exposed their corruption, destroyed their carefully fabricated defenses. The only difference was that now she wasn't in a courtroom. There were no judges, no juries, no cameras. Out here, on this dark, empty parking lot, justice wasn't a matter of law, it was a matter of survival. Mitchell shifted his stance, straightening his back, rolling his shoulders, as if shaking off the embarrassment of the last few moments. His jaw tightened, and the smirk that had briefly disappeared forced its way back onto his face, though now it was less confident and more of a mask for the resentment boiling beneath the surface. He turned his attention to Eastwood, the veteran actor standing there like he owned the ground beneath his boots, arms still crossed, cigarette still burning between his fingers. Mitchell clenched his teeth. He had grown up watching this man in movies, idolizing his brand of law and order, the kind where justice wasn't decided in a courtroom but delivered through the barrel of a gun or the crack of a fist. And yet here he was, staring at him like he was nothing more than a schoolyard bully who had just been caught by the principal. The realization sent another wave of rage surging through him. He turned back to Monica. "You think this is funny?" His voice was lower now, no longer teasing, no longer playing around. There was no amusement left in him. "You think you can come into my town, run your damn mouth in my courtrooms, and now you're going to stand here and act like you're above me?" He took a step closer. "You ain't above shit." Monica didn't react. She didn't need to. She could feel his desperation in every word, in the way his voice quivered despite his best attempts to keep it steady. This wasn't about justice, wasn't about law enforcement. This was about power, about dominance, about a man who had just lost control and couldn't handle it. The smart thing for him to do would be to walk away. But Mitchell wasn't smart. He was the kind of man who only knew how to solve problems with his fists. And Monica was done playing games. Before he could make another move, before he could even register what was happening, she took a single step forward, her voice steady, deliberate. "You don't scare me." Mitchell's fingers twitched again. Monica smirked. "But I can see that I scare you." That was it. That was the trigger. Mitchell snapped. His arm swung forward, fast and hard, aiming for her shoulder, for her face, for anything he could grab, but Monica had been waiting. She stepped sideways, letting his momentum carry him past her, twisting at just the right moment to send him staggering forward. He caught himself quickly, but by the time he turned around, she was already resetting her stance, her hands loose, her weight balanced. She was trained. That realization hit him like a punch to the gut. But it was too late for second thoughts. Mitchell lunged again, but this time he was ready, keeping his feet steady, expecting another dodge. Except Monica didn't dodge. She sidestepped just enough to avoid his grasp, then drove the heel of her palm into his ribs with controlled force. The impact sent a shockwave of pain through his side, forcing him to stumble back. His hand instinctively went to his gun. And that's when Eastwood moved. No hesitation. No warning. 1 second he was standing there, a passive observer, and the next, his boot was slamming into the side of Mitchell's knee. The cop let out a sharp grunt as his leg buckled, his grip on his holster failing as he collapsed onto one knee. The cigarette fell from Eastwood's lips, landing beside Mitchell's hand, the ember still glowing dimly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Mitchell's breath came in short, ragged bursts. His knee throbbed. His pride burned hotter than the pain. He looked up, vision blurring slightly, and saw Eastwood staring down at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the kind of calm, unshaken authority that men like Mitchell could never achieve. The kind that didn't come from power but from knowing that power meant nothing without control. Eastwood finally spoke, his voice as steady as ever. "You done." Mitchell swallowed hard, his fingers twitching again, this time not with anger, but with the last remnants of his shattered ego trying to piece themselves back together. He wanted to fight, wanted to claw back the control he had lost. But his body wouldn't let him. His pride wouldn't let him admit defeat, but his knee screamed at him to stay down. Monica exhaled, rolling her shoulder slightly before crouching in front of him, her expression unreadable. "What's the matter?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Not so fun when you're on the other end, huh?" Mitchell gritted his teeth, his hands forming tight fists against the pavement. His entire world was collapsing in on itself. His authority, his reputation, his image, everything he had built for himself was crumbling right here, on this empty parking lot, beneath the heel of an old cowboy and the weight of his own unchecked arrogance. Monica leaned in just enough that only he could hear her next words. "If you ever try to touch me again, I won't stop at breaking your wrist." She straightened, turning away without waiting for a response. Eastwood watched her go, then turned his gaze back to Mitchell, who was still kneeling, still humiliated, still seething. The actor crouched slightly, resting one forearm on his knee, giving the younger man a long, measured look. "Some advice, son." His voice was low, steady. "Walk away. While you still got both your legs." And then, just like that, it was over. Eastwood straightened, turning away, following Monica toward her car. Mitchell remained frozen, his body refusing to move, his mind screaming at him to do something, anything, to take back what had been stolen from him. But all he could do was sit there, in the dirt, watching as the two of them disappeared into the night, leaving him with nothing but the bitter taste of his own failure and the slow, agonizing realization that for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one with the power. Mitchell's entire body tensed as he struggled to process what had just happened. His knee throbbed from the force of Eastwood's kick, his ribs still ached from Monica's well-placed strike, but more than anything, it was his pride that had taken the worst beating of all. He had never felt this kind of humiliation before, never been made to feel powerless, never had the tables turned on him so completely. His breath came in short, ragged bursts as he remained on the ground, watching Monica and Eastwood turn their backs on him as if he were nothing, as if he didn't matter. That was the part that burned the most, the part that made his fingers twitch with barely contained rage. They weren't just walking away from him, they were dismissing him, treating him like a threat that had already been neutralized. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. He had built his entire existence around control, around making sure that no one ever got the better of him, that no one ever questioned his authority, his power. He had spent years enforcing his will on the streets, making sure that people like Monica knew their place, that they never forgot who held the real power. And now, in the span of a few minutes, all of that had been shattered. His pulse pounded in his ears as his mind raced, grasping for anything that would allow him to regain the upper hand, to take back control before it was too late. He had to act. He had to do something before this moment became permanent, before it cemented itself in his mind as the moment he let them win. His fingers twitched against the pavement as he slowly pushed himself up, ignoring the sharp protest from his injured knee. He refused to be seen like this, refused to be remembered as the man who went down without a fight. He wasn't going to let them just walk away. not without making sure they understood exactly who they were dealing with. Monica heard the scuff of his boots against the pavement before he moved, but she didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She already knew what was coming. Men like Mitchell didn't just take a loss and move on. They didn't know how. They had spent their entire lives believing they were untouchable, that the world existed to bow to them, to obey their every command. And when that illusion was shattered, they either crumbled under the weight of their own failures or lashed out in desperation. She had a feeling Mitchell wasn't the type to crumble. He was too consumed by his own ego, too blinded by the need to assert dominance. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore, wasn't considering the consequences of what he was about to do. He was running on pure emotion, and that made him reckless, dangerous. She could feel the shift in the air, the tension coiling around them like a storm about to break. She knew she should just get in her car, just leave him to his anger and let him stew in his own failure. But there was something in her that wouldn't allow it. Something that refused to let men like him believe, even for a second, that they could still win. Mitchell's body moved before his mind could catch up, his hand reaching for the baton at his waist as he charged forward, his vision red with fury. He wasn't thinking about what would happen next, wasn't thinking about consequences or repercussions. He was only thinking about making her pay, about making her understand that no one humiliated him and walked away unscathed. The baton came down fast, a blur of motion aimed at the back of her legs, meant to drop her to the ground where she belonged. But she was faster. She had been waiting for this. In one fluid motion, she sidestepped his attack, the baton whistling past her with inches to spare. Before he could recover, before he could shift his weight, she moved. Her knee drove up into his stomach, the impact forcing the air from his lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp. His body folded instinctively, his grip on the baton loosening for a split second, just enough time for her to twist it from his grasp and shove him back with the force of his own momentum. He stumbled, barely catching himself before he went down again, his breath still coming in short, pained gasps as his mind struggled to catch up with what had just happened. Eastwood watched from a few feet away, his expression unreadable, his cigarette burning low between his fingers. He had seen enough fights in his life to recognize a man who had already lost. Mitchell just didn't know it yet. There was no winning for him anymore, no path forward that didn't end in another failure. And yet, he could see the stubbornness in the younger man's eyes, the refusal to accept reality. Some men didn't know when to quit, when to walk away with whatever dignity they had left. It was almost pathetic. Almost. But there was a part of Eastwood that had to admire the sheer bullheadedness of it, even as he knew it would only make things worse. Mitchell straightened, his body still shaking from the exertion, from the pain, from the sheer rage that had taken hold of him. He wasn't done. He couldn't be done. He reached for his gun. And that was when Eastwood moved. It happened in an instant. 1 second Mitchell's hand was on his holster, his fingers curling around the grip of his firearm, and the next, Eastwood's boot connected with his wrist with enough force to send a sharp crack echoing through the parking lot. The gun clattered to the pavement, skidding out of reach before Mitchell could even register what had happened. And then, just as quickly, Eastwood was on him, his hand fisting in the front of Mitchell's uniform and yanking him forward with a strength that didn't match his age. Mitchell barely had time to process the shift before he was slammed up against the side of his own patrol car, his breath leaving him in a sharp, pained grunt. Eastwood's voice was low, steady, dangerous. You ever pull that on someone who isn't armed, who isn't threatening you, who's just minding their damn business? He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't need one. He could see it in the way Mitchell's eyes darted, the way his body went stiff, the way he swallowed hard against the reality of what had just happened. He wasn't used to being the one overpowered, wasn't used to being put in his place. Eastwood leaned in just slightly, his grip tightening. "You're not a cop. You're a coward hiding behind a badge. And the problem with cowards is they always think they can get away with shit. Until they don't." Mitchell didn't say anything. He couldn't. His entire body was frozen, his mind barely able to comprehend what was happening. His fingers twitched, his breath shallow and ragged, his pulse a hammering drumbeat in his ears. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how things worked. He was the one who gave orders, who dictated how things went. He was the one people feared, the one people obeyed. But right now, in this moment, he wasn't anything. He was just a man pressed up against his own car by someone who had seen more men like him than he could ever imagine, someone who had already judged him and found him lacking. Monica took a step closer, her voice calm, measured. "What's the matter, officer?" There was no mockery in her tone, no sarcasm, just cold, quiet certainty. "Not so fun when you're on the other side, is it?" Mitchell swallowed hard, his pride warring with the undeniable truth pressing against him from all sides. He had lost, and worse, he knew they knew it. Eastwood released him abruptly, stepping back, watching as Mitchell slumped against the car, his legs barely holding him up. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had just happened, with everything that would never be the same after this moment. Eastwood finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Get in your car, drive away, and pray you never see either of us again." Mitchell hesitated for just a second too long. Monica smiled, just slightly. "Or don't. We can finish this another way." Mitchell's fingers flexed against the car's surface. He inhaled sharply, then slowly, carefully, turned, opened the driver's side door, and slid inside. He didn't look at them again, didn't say another word. He just started the engine, gripped the wheel with white-knuckled hands and drove. Away from them. Away from this night. Away from the version of himself he could never get back. Mitchell's hands gripped the wheel with so much force his knuckles turned white, the tendons in his forearms tightening as his breathing came in ragged bursts. His pulse was erratic, hammering against his skull as his patrol car sped down the empty stretch of highway, headlights carving a violent path through the night. His entire body was a battlefield of pain. His knee throbbed from Eastwood's kick, his ribs still ached from Monica's strike, and his wrist felt like it had been caught in a vice grip after being stomped into the pavement. But none of that compared to the sheer humiliation burning through him like acid. He could still feel their eyes on him, their calm dismissal, the weight of his own weakness crushing down on him. He had spent his whole life believing he was the one in control, that his badge granted him unquestioned authority, that his fists, his gun, his presence alone were enough to keep people in line. And yet, tonight, none of it had mattered. Monica had made a fool out of him, exposed him for the fraud he had always feared he might be. Eastwood had barely lifted a finger and still reduced him to nothing. And now they were just walking away, as if he had never been a threat at all. That, more than anything, was what he couldn't stomach. He needed to get that control back. He needed to remind them who the hell he was. His fingers twitched over the radio, instinct screaming at him to call it in, to twist the narrative in his favor, to turn this into an official matter where he was the victim and they were the aggressors. He could claim Monica had attacked him, that Eastwood had interfered, that he had feared for his life. He had done it before, had manufactured situations to justify his actions, had planted evidence when necessary to ensure his version of events was the only one that mattered. But something about tonight felt different, felt bigger. He knew Monica wasn't just some random woman. She was a lawyer, and not just any lawyer, one with power, influence, connections. She had fought men like him in court and won. She would fight again. She wouldn't let this slide. She would use every resource at her disposal to expose him, to take him down piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the authority he had spent years carefully constructing. The thought sent another surge of anger coursing through his veins. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. He needed to get ahead of this. He needed to act now, before she had the chance to turn the tables against him. His mind raced through his options, filtering through every possible scenario, every way he could come out on top. An accident. A confrontation gone wrong. Something that could be pinned on her, something that would make sure she never walked into a courtroom again. His grip on the wheel tightened further, his foot pressing down harder on the gas pedal as the plan solidified in his mind. He knew people who could make problems disappear. He had used them before, off the books, no paper trail, just a favor for a favor. Men who didn't wear badges but understood the power they wielded. Men who did the kind of work that required silence, precision, finality. If he played this right, Monica Davis would never make it to the morning. And as for Eastwood, well, he was just an old man. The world had a way of forgetting about old men. Back in the parking lot, Monica exhaled slowly, rolling the tension out of her shoulders as she leaned against her car, her fingers absently brushing over the handle of the door. The fight was over, but the weight in her chest told her this wasn't finished. Mitchell was the kind of man who didn't take losses well. She had seen it before, had watched men like him fall apart when their authority was challenged, had seen them scramble to regain control, often in the worst ways possible. She knew he wasn't just going to let this go. He couldn't. He was too small of a man with too much to prove. Her eyes drifted toward Eastwood, who stood a few feet away, his cigarette burning low between his fingers, his expression unreadable. He had barely said a word since Mitchell left, had just watched the road where the patrol car disappeared, his body still, his presence heavy with something unspoken. She had read about men like him, had grown up watching him in films where justice was delivered through quiet, brutal efficiency, where bad men met bad endings, where the world was simpler than it was now. But standing here, seeing him in real life, she realized something else. This wasn't just an act. He carried that same energy with him, that same quiet certainty, that same ability to look at a man and know exactly what he was going to do before he even did it. He knew. He knew what was coming next. "You should leave town," he finally said, his voice low even. Monica arched a brow, crossing her arms over her chest, and let him think he won. Eastwood smirked, but there was no amusement in it. "No, but you and I both know men like that don't let things slide." "I know," she admitted. "But I'm not going anywhere." He nodded slightly, as if he had expected that answer. The night stretched out around them, heavy with silence, with the weight of what was coming. Then, a sound, faint at first, distant, but growing louder. An engine, low and smooth, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Monica stiffened slightly, her fingers brushing against the edge of the car door. Eastwood's posture shifted just enough that he was prepared for whatever was coming. The headlights appeared first, slicing through the darkness as the vehicle approached. Not a police car. Something else. Something heavier. The black SUV rolled into the lot, its tinted windows reflecting the neon glow from the bar sign. It moved slowly, deliberately, like a predator sizing up its prey. It came to a stop just a few yards away, its engine humming softly beneath the hood. Eastwood didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. The driver's side door opened. A man stepped out, not a cop, not someone Monica recognized, but she knew the type. The kind of man who didn't ask questions, who only showed up when there was a job to do. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides as she forced herself to breathe evenly, her mind already calculating the next move, already bracing for the inevitability of what was coming. This wasn't a warning. This wasn't intimidation. This was an execution. The man took a slow step forward, his posture relaxed, but his presence was suffocating. He had the look of someone who had done this before, who had walked into dark parking lots and left them with blood on his hands. He wasn't alone. Another door opened. Then another. 3 men in total, no badges, no uniforms, just shadows with intent. Eastwood took one last drag from his cigarette, then flicked it onto the pavement, crushing it beneath his boot. Well, he muttered. Guess he didn't take the hint. Monica inhaled deeply, rolling her shoulders, steadying herself. She had fought men before, had faced threats worse than this. But something about this was different. Something about this felt final. The lead man stopped a few feet away, tilting his head slightly as he studied them. No sudden moves, he said, his voice flat, void of emotion. It'll be easier that way, Monica's pulse steadied. Her mind cleared. She had been right. Mitchell wasn't the kind of man who let things go. And now he had sent someone to make sure she never walked away from this night alive. The night was thick with the kind of silence that didn't feel natural, the kind that came before something violent, something irreversible. Monica could feel it pressing in on her chest, the weight of it making every breath feel measured, controlled. The men in front of her weren't like Mitchell. They weren't driven by ego or pride. They weren't looking for a fight to prove their dominance. They were here for a reason, and that reason was to make sure she and Eastwood never left this parking lot alive. The lead man's expression was unreadable, but his eyes told her everything she needed to know. Cold, calculated, professional. This wasn't an impulsive act of revenge. This was a job. And when men like this were sent to do a job, they finished it. No hesitation. No loose ends. Eastwood hadn't moved, his stance relaxed but not careless, his hands still at his sides, fingers loose, but Monica could see the shift in his posture, the way his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, the almost imperceptible twitch in his right hand. He was ready. She had seen enough fighters, enough warriors in courtrooms and on the streets, to know when someone wasn't afraid to do what needed to be done. And she knew with absolute certainty that Clint Eastwood had no intention of dying in this parking lot tonight. The question was whether these men understood that. The leader took another step forward, his boots scuffing against the pavement, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He wasn't holding a weapon yet, but Monica knew that meant nothing. A gun was probably tucked in his waistband, another in an ankle holster. He didn't need to flash them to make his point. His presence alone was enough. Let's not make this difficult, he said, his voice steady, almost casual, like he was discussing the weather. You both get in the car. We take a drive. That's it. Monica exhaled slowly, her mind working through the variables, the probabilities. If they got in that car, they were dead. Maybe not immediately, maybe not until they reached some deserted stretch of road, some quiet place where bodies wouldn't be found for days, but that didn't matter. The ending was the same. If they went with them, they never came back. That wasn't an option. She shifted her weight slightly, her muscles tensing, her eyes flicking to Eastwood, who was watching the men with the kind of expression that sent chills down a person's spine. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anger. It was disappointment, like he had expected better from the world, but had long since stopped being surprised when it failed to deliver. You know, Eastwood said, his voice low, almost conversational, I was really hoping to finish my damn cigarette before the night got worse. The leader's jaw twitched, his patience thinning. Get in the car. Eastwood sighed, shaking his head like a man who had seen too much of the same thing, the same mistakes, the same predictable patterns. You boys ever hear of a bad idea? The second man, the one standing to the left, shifted slightly, his stance widening, his fingers curling just enough that Monica caught the movement. A fighter. Trained, waiting for an opening. "You've got 3 seconds," the leader said, his tone hardening. 1. Eastwood's fingers twitched. 2. Monica didn't wait for 3. She moved fast, pivoting on her back foot, driving her elbow into the second man's throat before he could react, the force of the blow making him stagger, choking on his own breath. She didn't stop. She couldn't. She twisted, her heel slamming into the side of his knee, dropping him completely. The leader reached for his gun. Eastwood moved before the weapon cleared the holster. His boot connected with the leader's wrist, sending the gun flying into the darkness. The third man, the one who had stayed back, hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. Eastwood's fist crashed into his jaw, a sharp, bone-cracking sound splitting the air as the man reeled back, his body slamming against the side of the SUV. Monica turned, ducking as the second man, despite being on one knee, swung at her. His fist glanced off her shoulder, but it was enough to send a jolt of pain shooting down her arm. She gritted her teeth, grabbed the collar of his jacket, and yanked him forward, driving her knee into his stomach with enough force that he crumpled, gasping for air. The leader recovered fast, too fast. His hand reached for something else, a knife this time, not a gun. Faster, easier, silent. Monica barely had time to react before he lunged. She twisted, but not fast enough. The blade caught the edge of her jacket, slicing through the fabric, grazing her side. Pain bloomed, sharp and hot, but she didn't let it stop her. She grabbed his wrist, twisted hard, using his own momentum against him, forcing him forward as she drove her other hand into his throat. He stumbled, choking, but he wasn't done. He never would be. Eastwood didn't give him the chance. The older man moved with the kind of precision that came from experience, from years of knowing exactly how to end a fight before it could begin. He grabbed the leader by the back of the neck, slammed his face into the hood of the SUV with a sickening crunch. The man went limp. The third one was still conscious, still breathing, but he wasn't moving. He knew better. Monica exhaled sharply, her hand pressing against her side, feeling the warmth of blood seeping through the torn fabric. It wasn't deep, wasn't life-threatening, but it hurt like hell. Eastwood turned to her, eyes scanning the wound before flicking back to the unconscious men on the ground. "Well," he muttered, "that was messy." Monica let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. "You could have helped sooner." Eastwood shrugged. "Seemed like you had it under control." The third man, the only one still conscious, shifted slightly, wincing. Monica stepped toward him, towering over his broken form. "You go back to Mitchell," she said, her voice steady, cold, "and you tell him this was his only chance." The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. Eastwood glanced at the SUV, then at the bodies on the ground. "What do you want to do with them?" Monica thought about it, thought about the choices, thought about what came next. "Leave them," she said finally. "They're not our problem anymore." Eastwood nodded, as if he had expected that answer. They turned, walking toward their respective cars, blood drying on Monica's side, adrenaline still pounding through her veins. This wasn't over. Not yet. But the message had been sent, and Mitchell had just made the worst mistake of his life. The air was thick with the scent of blood, oil and sweat, the metallic tang of violence still lingering in Monica's nose as she pressed a hand to her side, feeling the sticky warmth of her own blood soaking through the torn fabric of her jacket. The pain was manageable, but it was a reminder, a sharp, unyielding signal that tonight was far from over. The 3 men lay motionless in the parking lot, 2 of them unconscious, one barely clinging to awareness, his body curled up like a beaten dog, his breath ragged as he fought through the agony of broken ribs and a shattered jaw. He wasn't going to be a threat anymore. None of them were. But they weren't the real problem. Mitchell was. Monica exhaled slowly, forcing her heartbeat to settle, forcing her focus to sharpen. She could still feel the weight of his presence, the way he had loomed over her earlier, the raw hatred burning in his eyes when he realized he had lost control. She knew men like him. They didn't take defeat lightly. They didn't walk away. They found new ways to assert their dominance, new ways to rewrite the story so that they came out on top. He had already sent men to take care of her once, and when they didn't return, he'd send more. But that wasn't the real issue. The real issue was that Mitchell wouldn't stop until he was forced to. He needed to be put down, permanently, before he found another way to strike. Eastwood stood a few feet away, rolling his shoulders, shaking out the stiffness in his hands after the brief but brutal fight. His gaze flickered over to Monica, assessing, taking in the way she held herself, the way she hid her pain well but not perfectly. He knew that feeling, knew what it was like to keep moving through the ache, to push forward, because stopping wasn't an option. He had done it his whole life. He wasn't about to tell her to slow down. He wasn't about to tell her to let this go. Because he knew, just as well as she did, that letting this go wasn't an option. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he asked, his voice as steady as ever, untouched by the chaos that had just unfolded. Monica's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Depends. Are you thinking about paying Mitchell a visit?" Eastwood nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I don't like unfinished business." Neither did she. They didn't speak as they climbed into their cars, didn't need to. The path forward was clear. The weight of inevitability settled between them as they pulled out of the parking lot, their engines low and rumbling as they moved through the night, toward the one place they both knew Mitchell would be, the police station. It wasn't about making a scene. It wasn't about revenge. It was about stopping this before it escalated into something worse, before Mitchell found another way to sink his claws into the situation and twist it in his favor. Because men like him always did. They always found a way. Unless someone stopped them first. The drive was quiet, tense. Monica's fingers flexed against the steering wheel as she kept her breathing steady, ignoring the pain pulsing from her wound. It didn't matter. Not now. They pulled up a block away from the station, the fluorescent lights spilling out onto the street, the occasional patrol car pulling in and out of the lot. It was late, but not late enough for the building to be empty. Eastwood turned to her, his expression unreadable in the dim glow of the dashboard. "You ready for this?" Monica smirked, rolling her shoulders. "Are you?" He huffed a quiet laugh but didn't answer. Instead, he pushed open his door, stepping out with the same calm confidence he always carried, as if the idea of walking straight into the lion's den didn't faze him in the slightest. Monica followed. The inside of the station was cold, sterile, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. A couple of officers lingered behind the front desk, one glancing up briefly before going back to whatever paperwork he was filling out. No one stopped them. No one questioned them. Not yet. Then, from the far end of the room, a door swung open. Mitchell. He stepped out into the main area, his uniform slightly disheveled, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like he was grinding his teeth down to dust. His eyes flickered between them, recognition flashing across his face, followed immediately by something darker, something uglier. He hadn't expected them to come here. He had expected them to disappear, to run, to retreat into the night like prey. But here they were, standing in his station, on his ground, and he had no idea what to do about it. Monica took a slow step forward, her voice even when she spoke. "You're not going to send any more of your guys after me, Mitchell." His lip curled, a mockery of a smirk. That's so. Eastwood moved beside her, his posture relaxed, but his presence was suffocating. Yeah, it is. Mitchell let out a breath through his nose, his fingers twitching slightly at his sides. You think walking in here is gonna scare me? You think I give a damn what you have to say? Monica tilted her head slightly, studying him. No, but I think you give a damn about what happens next. For the first time, there was hesitation in Mitchell's stance, the briefest flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. You sent 3 guys to take care of us, Eastwood continued, his voice low, steady. They lost. You know what that means. Mitchell's jaw tightened. It means your next Monica finished for him. A muscle in his cheek twitched. His breath came faster now, shallower. He was weighing his options, trying to decide if he could still turn this around. You think you can walk in here and threaten me, he growled. But there was something behind his voice now. Fear. Eastwood leaned in just slightly, his voice dropping to something almost conversational. Not a threat, just a fact. The silence that followed was deafening. Mitchell's mind was racing, his body rigid with tension. He could feel the walls closing in, could feel the power he had wielded for so long slipping through his grasp like sand. He wasn't in control anymore. And the realization made his stomach churn. Monica took a step closer, her voice quiet, measured. Walk away, Mitchell. Leave this alone. Because if you don't, you won't like what happens next. Mitchell didn't respond right away. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his hands flexing at his sides as if he was still trying to decide whether to fight or fold. But in the end, there was no choice. Not really. He turned sharply on his heel and stormed back through the door he had come from, disappearing into the depths of the station. Eastwood exhaled slowly, watching him go before glancing at Monica. Think he got the message, she smiled faintly. I think it's sinking in. They turned without another word, walking back out into the night, leaving the weight of the confrontation behind them. It wasn't a perfect ending. It wasn't justice in the traditional sense, but it was enough. For now. Halfway from now. The cold night air bit at Monica's skin as she stepped out of the police station, her heartbeat still steady, but her muscles tight with the residue of adrenaline. The confrontation with Mitchell had ended without fists or bullets, but the weight of it still hung thick in the air. She knew he had gotten the message. She had seen it in his eyes, that flicker of fear buried beneath his rage, that unmistakable moment of realization when he understood that he wasn't the one in control anymore. But fear alone wasn't enough to stop men like him. It wasn't enough to erase the kind of arrogance that had been drilled into his bones for years. It wasn't enough to make him walk away forever. No, this wasn't over. Not yet. Eastwood walked beside her, his movements slow, methodical, as if he were calculating his next step, even though the battle had technically ended. Monica could feel his gaze on her, could sense the way he was reading her posture, her silence. He was the kind of man who didn't need words to understand what came next. He had been through too many wars, both on screen and off, to believe in clean endings. You think he's done? He asked, voice quiet but firm. Monica exhaled through her nose, shaking her head slightly. No, but I think he's going to lay low, for a while at least. Eastwood smirked, lighting a cigarette, taking a slow drag before responding. For a while ain't good enough. She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. No, it's not. The hum of streetlights and the occasional distant siren were the only sounds filling the silence between them as they walked toward their cars. There was no point in lingering. They had done what they came to do, sent the message that needed to be sent. But the problem with men like Mitchell wasn't just that they refused to let things go, was that they didn't know how to live with defeat. He would find another way to crawl back, to reassert control, to strike when they least expected it. Unless they made sure he never got the chance. Monica stopped just short of her car, turning to Eastwood fully now, her jaw set, her expression unreadable. "You think this ends here?" Eastwood tilted his head slightly, tapping the ash from his cigarette onto the pavement. "Depends." She arched a brow. "On what?" He took another slow drag, exhaling the smoke into the night before finally answering. "On how much of a problem you want to be for him." Monica huffed out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I don't think I've ever been the kind of problem that goes away quietly." Eastwood nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Then we finish it." She didn't need him to elaborate. She knew what he meant. She had spent years fighting men like Mitchell in courtrooms, using the law as her weapon, dismantling them piece by piece until they had no choice but to fall. But there were times when the law wasn't enough, when the people who twisted it in their favor knew how to slip through the cracks no matter how many times they were exposed. Sometimes, the only way to deal with men like that was to cut them off at the root. Mitchell was already a dead man walking. He just didn't know it yet. The drive was silent, both of them lost in their own thoughts, the weight of the inevitable pressing down like an anchor. Monica kept her hands steady on the wheel, her mind working through the logistics of what was about to happen. Mitchell had survived this long by surrounding himself with allies, with men who looked the other way, who saw his kind of corruption as just another part of the job. That was the problem with the system, too many people who benefited from looking the other way. But tonight, there would be no more looking away. They pulled up to Mitchell's house just after 3 in the morning. The quiet suburban street bathed in the eerie glow of streetlights, the world around them still, undisturbed. His patrol car was parked in the driveway, his house dark except for a single dim light in one of the front windows. He was home. Monica killed the engine, glancing at Eastwood, who was already reaching for something beneath his jacket. A gun. "Of course." "You sure about this?" she asked. Voice low, Eastwood looked at her, his gaze steady, unwavering. "You." She let out a breath, her grip tightening around the door handle. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." They moved in sync, stepping out of the car, their footsteps silent against the pavement. They weren't here to make a scene. They weren't here to play games. They were here to end this. The front door was locked, but locks were just formalities. A quick, precise kick from Eastwood sent it flying open, the wood splintering from the force. They stepped inside, weapons drawn, the air inside thick with the scent of stale beer and something sour, something rotten. The kind of smell that clung to men like Mitchell, the kind of filth that no amount of power or authority could mask. A noise. A shift in the darkness, then movement. Mitchell was already reaching for his gun when they found him, his breath coming fast, his hands shaking. He had been waiting for this. He had known, deep down, that they would come. Monica raised her weapon, steady, unwavering. "Don't." Mitchell's lip curled, his grip on the gun tightening. "You think I'm scared of you?" Eastwood took a slow step forward, his voice as calm as ever. "No, but you should be." There was a moment of hesitation, a flicker of something almost like acceptance in Mitchell's expression. He knew. He had always known that this was where it would end. But some men didn't know how to surrender. The gun came up. Monica fired first. The shot rang out like a thunderclap, the bullet hitting true, center mass, knocking Mitchell back against the wall. His body slid down slowly, his eyes wide, his breath hitching, blood spreading fast across his uniform, soaking into the fabric. He gasped, choking, his fingers twitching around the grip of his gun before it slipped from his grasp, clattering uselessly to the floor. His mouth moved, as if he wanted to say something, as if he wanted to make one last desperate attempt to hold onto the power that had already left him. But there was nothing left to say. Eastwood stepped forward, crouching slightly, looking down at the man who had once thought himself untouchable. "You had your chance," he murmured. Mitchell's eyes flickered once. Then he was gone. Monica exhaled slowly, lowering her weapon, the weight of the moment settling in her bones. It wasn't satisfaction she felt. It wasn't victory. It was just inevitability. They turned, stepping back out into the night, leaving the body behind, leaving the past behind. There would be no investigation, no questions. The people who had protected Mitchell for so long would let this disappear, just like they had let so many of his crimes disappear. But this time, the right person had disappeared. Monica glanced at Eastwood as they reached the car, the old man lighting another cigarette, exhaling slowly as he leaned against the hood. "You good?" he asked. She nodded, rolling her shoulders, letting the tension bleed away. "Yeah," Eastwood smirked, taking another drag. "Told you it'd be messy." She let out a breath, a quiet laugh escaping her lips. Wouldn't have it any other way. The night stretched on, the weight of what had been done fading into the darkness, swallowed by the silence of the world around them. The job was done. Mitchell was gone. And for the first time in a long time, Monica Davis finally felt free.